But, to me, it would just be really cool if somebody saw that logo and thought, "Oh, yeah, I've heard of that," even if they hadn't. You know what I mean? Because then it's like it's already in your mind. So that team is already established. Like that's a really cool thing. And like, logos are one of those things. I'm a tattoo artist by profession, so drawing stuff all day that I think is going to stand the test of time is my ultimate goal. But if somebody sees a logo and feels like, oh man, I feel like I know what that is, that does half the battle of spreading the word out there too.
That was musician, tattoo artist, and designer of the Irish Wolfhounds logo, Eddie MacIntosh. Hello, and welcome to episode 90 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Eddie's going to be my guest on the show, and we will talk about all of his different artistic interests. Of course, Eddie MacIntosh designed the logo for the Irish Wolfhounds, and you can keep up with the team and purchase some gear with Eddie's logo on it by heading to our website, irishbaseball.org. That's also where you can go to listen to every past episode of the Irish Baseball Podcast. Let's get things started with today's show. Thanks for being here, Eddie.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
The very first thing I want to discuss with you is we'll talk about a lot of your other passions art-wise, but you designed the logo for the Irish Wolfhounds. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and how you came up with that design?
Sure. John Fitzgerald had a very sort of concrete idea of what it is he was looking for. So my biggest thing was there's a weird formula that goes around now with a lot of logos, like in I don't know, they're like an app or what is going on with like collegiate logos, especially like collegiate logos. There's like this really thick border. They all look like they came from like just the same program, and I wanted to make sure that we avoided that. And luckily, I think John kind of was on board with that as well. I'm a really retro aesthetic guy, so I think John had to like reel me back into what the rest of the world would appreciate as a logo versus what I would, personally probably push for. And he's right. But yeah, just to come up with something that, especially with the gravity that, the Wolfhounds have and what it means and what, the goal of everything is, to me, making something that sort of looked automatically timeless was the way to go. You don't want to have that thing where a logo looks, frozen in the 90s or whatever. Sometimes you look back and you're like, man, I had that t-shirt of, like the Charlotte Hornets parka that everybody had back in the day.
I was just talking about that at work today, how nobody I knew was a fan of the Charlotte Hornets, but literally everybody I knew had that starter jacket for some reason.
Yeah, it was like purple and teal had never been combined before or something, So to me, I wanted to sort of, throw something out that looked like it had already been established. And, I just kept kind of spitballing stuff back and forth with John. And eventually, he liked what I came up with. And yeah, I was just super honored, honestly,
I think one of the things that I like about it, and baseball fans, I think, definitely do get into things like logos a lot more than maybe even other sports fans. So when I look at a logo for something that is trying to show, pushing forward and trying to accomplish something, but also, deeply traditional with, the connections to Ireland, with the Wolfhound itself, and you did accomplish something that looked like it had been around for decades, even though it's a team that has been around for a year.
I really appreciate that, man. That was definitely what I intended. I mean, to me, it's like I said, John had a very cool idea of like, okay, no with that, yes with this. And, luckily I was able to kind of steer things into something that he agreed on. But, to me, it would just be really cool if somebody saw that logo and thought, oh, yeah, I've heard of that, even if they hadn't. You know what I mean? Because then it's like it's already in your mind. So that team is already established. Like, that's a really cool thing. And, like, logos are one of those things. I'm a tattoo artist by profession. So drawing stuff all day that I think is going to stand the test of time is my ultimate goal. But if somebody sees a logo and feels like, Oh man, I feel like I know what that is. That does half the battle of spreading the word out there too, you know?
So I did want to talk about you being a tattoo artist, and you design a logo and maybe you email it back to John Fitzgerald, the founder of the Irish American Baseball Society, and you say, "Hey, what do you think about this logo?" And John might look at it and say, "Well, let's tweak this and tweak
Yeah.
this." And then you can send something back and there's not that finality to it. But I've always been interested in you as a tattoo artist. There comes a point where there is no more, you know, there's no more collaboration. It goes on the skin and it has to look good for the rest of time. So, whereas
Yeah.
other artists might say, oh, I'm a photographer, I'll take 200 pictures and I'll find the one that's the best, or a painter might be able to go over a mistake or shade something a little differently than they expected on the first time. You have the first time you're putting it on that skin, and that's all you have. So, what is that like? And is it pressure or is it almost exhilarating?
It's definitely everything should be the right amount of stressful, like because it is something permanent. My mentor in tattooing, Chris Lowe, he always kind of instilled upon me that ultimately, a tattoo is for the wearer's ego, not the artist's ego. There's a lot of, artists now, especially with all the TV shows that, you know, make people feel like they're not cool enough to be in there getting a tattoo. Tattooing is a working man's art. Strangely enough, even has an Irish connection. In electric tattooing, Samuel O'Reilly, who was first generation American born to Irish parents, he patented the first electric tattoo machine. So everything we do actually has Irish roots in it. But ultimately, a tattoo, you don't want to do something that is a bad piece of art. If something has somebody has an idea that I know is not going to make a good tattoo, I don't want my name going out the door on it. But I also don't want to steer somebody into doing something that I think is cool. I mean, I've tattooed priests, I've tattooed people who I'm sure were not priests, if you know what I'm saying. I've tattooed professional athletes. I've tattooed people that tattooing is a working class art, and that's kind of where it should stay. Unfortunately, some of the TV show glitz and glamour has kind of steered people away from that. Um, so it's an honor more than anything else. So the pressure, it's exhilarating when you see somebody's reaction. You feel like you've really brought what they wanted to them for the rest of their life. It's very rewarding. But and there is a great pressure on making sure everything that you do is 100% something you're proud of, but ultimately something they're proud of as well. I mean, the toughest guy, gets a Hello Kitty for his daughter. It's a Hello Kitty tattoo, but at the end of the day, that might mean more than anything, you've tattooed on the biggest badass out there. Doing the t-shirt stuff is a little easier. John doesn't like it. It's not on him permanently. He sends it back. We bounce it back and forth. We high five at the end. Everybody's happy.
Absolutely. And you talk about this being an art that is kind of connected to the Irish. But another thing about tattoos is I think a lot of people do reach into their heritage and try to show their heritage through the art that they get on their skin. I have a boss he's half Korean and he has, Korean art on one of his arms, and
Mhm.
people get flags. And how often do you find that you're getting not only Irish people, and maybe you can relate and you can think of some designs there, but how often are you dealing with maybe people from other cultures and you have to sort of learn that aesthetic to try to deliver on a culture that isn't your own?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely quite a bit of that, and any tattooer that is worth their salt should be doing that kind of research. I myself, like you'll notice by my surname, like MacIntosh is a Scottish name. I grew up raised by the Scottish side of my family, but very much Irish on the other side. There's a lot of things that people get, especially Americans, that can be well-meaning but are not necessarily culturally correct, if you know what I'm saying. Like for instance, like with the Scottish side of things, you know, a family shield a lot of the time is really kind of owned by a clan chief. There's reasons you really shouldn't be getting that. There's different things. With Irish Americans, a lot of the time want to get something in Irish and Gaelic, but they don't necessarily realize that phrasing is not necessarily what Google Translate says it is. So you know you have to do a lot of deep dives in that, or you can get yourself in some dangerous territory. You know, that being said, I've learned a lot. You know, particularly Japanese culture. A lot of people will get things in, you know, in Japanese. They'll get things in Chinese. You see more and more things in Arabic. I work in a base across the street from NSA Fort Meade, so I have a lot of military clientele. A lot of these guys are linguists, so I'm learning new stuff all the time. They're bringing in Korean tattoos. They're bringing in all these things. I love it, man. It's so cool. Like just kind of you know, it's like getting a new college course and everything else. But the people that don't know, it's almost like we as artists have to do the background work to make sure, you know, you're not tattooing, you know, a Chinese food menu on somebody or something, you know.
I could imagine that there does come a lot of, really bad Google Translate and people who are definitely well meaning, but they haven't done necessarily all of the research. And somebody like you knows some of those pitfalls. Like you've probably experienced it before. So that's great. How long have you been doing tattoo artwork?
I've been tattooing professionally now for it's almost about 12 years. I actually was a special education teacher before that. So, you know, the normal route of career pursuits. You know, the owner of the shop that I work at now, Chris Lowe at Naked Art Tattoos, he used to come and see my band play, and we used to hang out and jaw together. I was working in the behavioral unit in one of the schools downtown. I got stabbed in the hand, and he said, "Hey, man, you like to draw? Why don't I take you on as an apprentice? It seems like it might be a safer way of make a living." And I kind of went off the deep end and kind of invested in myself and thought, you know, I'm going to try to make a living with my art. And, you know, 12, 13 years later, you know, here I am.
And how hard was that process of investing in yourself, becoming an apprentice, doing something that maybe you never thought you would be doing for a living? And here you are in a completely different field.
Yeah, it's initially was if I thought about it, it would have been terrifying. If somebody would have told me that I'd be making my money through music and art, I would be absolutely terrified. I also would have saved a lot of money on college. But no, it's definitely crazy. But you know, I love it. I've been very fortunate, and I have a lot of people that you know have sought up my art. So I'm very very blessed, very humbled by that.
And now, the main thing, you just brought it up, that I wanted to talk about today is your music. I love music. I got into broadcasting. I've been doing sports for a long time now, but I got into broadcasting on an alternative rock radio station.
Oh, nice.
So I really want to talk a lot about your rockabilly music
Sure.
and how your heritage, both Scottish and Irish, impacts your music, maybe some of the things that influence you and your style.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, playing rockabilly music, for those who kind of don't know the term, and it's one of those terms that is slowly becoming a bit more than what it encompasses to me. My band is a pretty traditional rockabilly band, so kind of in the vein of like Carl Perkins, Elvis, Johnny Cash, like the very old school, you know, stuff. Like we have a stand-up bass. I play rhythm guitar, which is acoustic. We have an electric guitar and a very stripped down drum set. um, I grew up sort of between most of the year in Baltimore, and then summers I spent in Nova Scotia, Canada, with my cousins and my family up there. My grandfather was actually a professional ice hockey player. I'm second generation American, but he was a professional ice hockey player. But Nova Scotia is a big stop on the diaspora. A lot of it is the Irish and Scottish music in Nova Scotia is insane. It's like some of the fiddle music is parallel in quality, you know, to that you'll find in Ireland or Scotland. Some of the tunes, you know, that I've heard in Dublin were written in Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. So I grew up with that music very much making me uncool a lot of my youth. um, and a bit of a weird sort of Nova Scotian meets Baltimore accent along the way, which was not terribly fun either. I was raised by my grandparents, so my taste in music has always been way behind what it should have been. Um, but yeah, fifties rockabilly, rock and roll stuff. There's definitely Irish roots in some of that because a lot of that was, rockabilly is sort of half African American blues and rock and roll, and half, sort of white country, Southern folk music kind of amalgamated into this sort of wild, combination of all things American in music. The sort of folky side of country and all that comes from Ireland, comes from Scotland. All that hillbilly music comes from Celtic culture to a large part. And especially for me, Irish songwriters have always been some of the best in the world. So I definitely drew from that. Even people that came sort of later than 50s music, like Brendan Behan, just one of my absolute favorite writers of all time. Like the Old Triangle, all these songs that were written from experience, all of these great poems. There's no question that some of the greatest folk music that sort of impacted that came from Irish writers. So growing up, spending my summers seeing Scottish and Irish folk music around all the time, there's no way that didn't just seep into my head. I wrote some absolutely terrible music as a kid that was probably based on, seafaring and whatnot as a 7-year-old, as you do.
I think it's interesting that you bring up rockabilly music combining the sort of Appalachian cultures, the Southern hillbilly cultures, and African American culture, because a lot of times when we talk about the history of Irish people in baseball, it comes around to the Irish using baseball as a way to ingratiate themselves into the broader society. Irish immigrants, second generation Irish people born here, used baseball in the late 1800s, early 20th century to, put themselves on the up and up with society. And that was something that was blocked out for African Americans until Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. And there's definitely this connection with the Irish and the African American community and how they both sort of were trying to use, we talk about baseball a lot, but music is another way that these two cultures tried to find some respect in society, a society that very much didn't want them in the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true. And musically, and even funny enough, look at some of the baseball songs that came out. There's a lot of Irish themed baseball songs that were sort of a way to push, yes, we're Irish, but we're also American. And then you look at things like all of the Jackie Robinson records that came out after Jackie broke the color barrier. The See Jackie Robinson Hit That Ball. There's like at least 12 versions of that song that came out, and a bunch after that as well. There's songs about Newcomb. They're all like ingratiating, themselves into like pop radio at that point, and that's music and baseball meeting as sort of yes, we're an ethnic enclave, but ultimately we're all pushing into this sort of American mainstream. And baseball and music are both great metaphors for like the sort of fighting spirit of wanting to be sort of accepted as American overall.
That is where we will leave things off with Eddie MacIntosh, but with someone who is involved in so many different projects. We will certainly be continuing this conversation in a future episode. Until then, I'm your host, Rick Becker, and this has been episode 90 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.